So we're talking about sticky prices.
So, how do we measure inflation?
That some
Now, there are different
prices
indices
can't
for different
change as fast as
purposes.
others. Some prices
For
update
converting
themselves
nominal
more
GDP to
slowly.
real GDP, the government uses
Because we
what's
live in a
called the
world that's
GDP
constantly being
deflator.
battered with
And for
supply and
consumers'
demand
cost of
shocks
living, the
in both
government uses the
directions.
consumer price
And the
index.
market equilibrates on its own.
And these are both
The
based on the
market
same
naturally
idea.
seeks its own level,
You're going to pick a year,
and it tends to do so
a
faster
period.
than any
Normally, we're
central
talking a year
planner
at a
could
time.
do it.
You're going to,
But
well,
that doesn't mean it does it
they
equally
do
quickly
calculate
for
this
different
month
goods.
to month.
And some things are pretty dang
The
slow.
point is, you're going to pick a
Now,
period
sticky
of time
prices
to
are
look
caused
at,
by numerous
and you use that as
factors.
your base.
And
your
one of them
base
is what's
month,
called
your
menu
base year,
costs,
whatever it may
literal
be.
costs of changing the price.
And then you pick a bundle of goods representative of normal
puzzle for you.
expenses,
Why do restaurants
and you measure
change
the
their
ratio of
prices
how much it
rarely?
increased.
Stores change them
Often
a
we
little
like to
more
use the
often.
metaphor of a
Gas
shopping
stations
cart.
change their prices
If you imagine a
constantly,
typical
and
shopping
stock
cart,
markets,
you know, a typical
spaz
like
out all
week's
day
worth of
long.
groceries and other household supplies, with a little bit of rent thrown in,
Why
with a
would the
little bit of
prices
utilities
be
and so
so
on and
much
so
more
forth.
stable for food
We're measuring the change in
than
the
for
shopping cart,
gas?
because the shopping cart has proportions
Well,
for
there's
each
different
good
answers a person could propose, but
that are representative
one of the big
of,
ones has to do with menu
you know,
costs.
a normal person's
That not all
purchases.
industries,
And the only difference between this GDP
that it's
deflator
not
and
free.
this
It's
consumer
not
price
free
index
to change your prices.
is that the
And
GDP
some
deflator is
industries
going to
are going to
include
face
things like
higher
raw materials and
costs
capital.
for changing
It
their
includes stuff
prices
that
than others.
producers care about.
The consumer
Now, the
price
term
index
menu
is
cost
specifically for consumers.
comes from literal
Products that
menus
you would go and
in
buy
restaurants.
You have constant little shocks.
Now, example of this
And
being
so it would be
calculated.
nice to be
Suppose
able
your
to
bundle
update
in
your prices.
2023 is 3 baubles, 2 gewgaws, and 1
Stores
gadget
could,
at $10,
restaurants could, for example,
$20,
charge
and
more on
$5
some days
each.
than others. I mean, sometimes they do that.
And
They'll have
so,
discounts
in
that they advertise.
2020,
But you could have
2023, I
congestion
should say,
pricing in a
in
restaurant that's very
2023,
busy.
the
You
bundle
could
will be
have,
$75.
you know, low prices
In
during times when it's
2024,
not as busy.
the prices change.
You could have
Baubles
your
skyrocket
prices
to
vary by a few
$15.
pennies. You know,
Gewgaws
if
actually
the
fall to $16,
if the truck
and
carrying
gadgets
potatoes
go
for
up
your
to
French fries
$8.
breaks down on the
And so if we take
the
the same
interstate,
amounts,
then you
3 baubles
jack
at
up
15,
the French fry prices that day. In theory, they could do
3
all
at
this,
15,
but in
2 at
practice,
16,
it's not
and
that
1 at
practical.
8.
Or at least it
Then
wasn't
15 times
until
3
very
plus
recently.
16 times 2
Not
plus
that
8
practical.
comes out to 85.
Because that restaurant has to print up a menu.
And then if you divide
menus are not cheap.
85 by 75, you get
Menus are not cheap.
1.13.
They can be.
The
Especially in a lot
inflation
of your
index
diners,
for
like little meat
2024
and around
is
here.
1.13.
You know, they might just have a sheet of paper. They literally printed it off.
And this
your
is
printer that
basically
day,
telling you,
and it costs them almost nothing. But
if
your
you want to
fancy
buy
restaurants, they don't
the
want to look,
same
you know,
goods in
poor.
2024,
So they
like
have to
if you
have
were to
some
spend
that's
$1
laminated.
in
They have to have some that
2023,
has design.
it would take you $1.13
They've got to hire a professional
to get the
design their
same
menu.
goods in 2024.
But this puts them in a bit of a bind.
And you would
Because
say
if
that
they
the
print up a bunch
inflation
of
rate
expensive menus,
is 13%.
then that means every time they want to change any price on the menu, they have to throw out all of them.
So it's this thought experiment. How much money would I have to buy? Would I have to have now
the
to buy
restaurant
the same
has to make
things
a
I
decision.
used to be able to buy?
When are the benefits of changing the menu greater than the costs of having to buy all
Now,
new ones?
like measuring GDP, measuring
the answer
inflation is going to be
that
fraught
often.
with problems. The bundle
Restaurants
people
are usually
buys
going to tolerate
changes over time.
a certain range of prices.
It can
They
change
know that
in part
sometimes
just
things
due
will be
to
higher,
changes
sometimes
in
things
taste.
will be lower.
Sometimes their inputs will be more expensive.
Things
like
come
break
in and
the
out of
ingredients.
fashion.
Sometimes
they'll be less so.
people want different kinds of products.
For the
It's
most
a little
part,
bit
this isn't going to be a
unpredictable,
big deal. But as
because
long as it
the
stays
bundle
within
is
this
abstract
this
enough to account
certain
for that.
range, you know,
They're
this,
targeting kind
interval
of
that
broad
they can
categories
tolerate,
of goods, and
the
you don't
restaurant can
see
still
huge
operate
shifts in broad
profitably.
categories of goods.
And if they see that there's some kind of
People don't suddenly
extreme
develop a
shift
taste for
in
a
the
lot more
equilibrium
housing
or in their
or a
input
lot more
prices,
entertainment, for example,
then they'll update it if the change seems like it's going to be
But it can be a
sustained.
lot more difficult
Is
to
this
try
temporary
to
or is it
quantify
permanent?
changes in quality.
You'll have an item that's more expensive, for
Now,
example, but is
not
it
all
more
products are going to be
expensive
listed on menus.
due to inflation, or
So,
is it more
for
expensive
example,
because it's better technology?
have you ever noticed that lobster
So with
tends to not be
automobiles, for
listed with a
example,
price?
you can kind of make cases in either direction
Why?
with those.
Why lobster specifically?
Modern cars are a
Well, it
lot
varies a
safer.
lot.
Modern cars have a lot better
Lobster has a
mileage
very
than they used
unstable
to.
supply,
A
especially
lot
the
of modern
quality
cars
of the
have
lobster they
electronics
get.
built in. You know, they'll have little TVs in the back seats.
If they were to put lobster on the
They'll
menu,
come with
they'd either have to
GPS
change the
maps
menu
built
constantly,
directly
which wouldn't
into it.
be
They'll have the
cost efficient,
self-driving capabilities.
or
Those are all things that your old
they'd have
cars didn't
to
have.
leave it the same,
Biggest
but
downside is that the old
potentially,
cars looked a heck of a lot
take
better.
losses on lobster regularly.
So if you were to
So you
compare the
see that
price
even
of
within an
a,
industry, even within
Cadillac
a
today
single
to a
business,
Cadillac
some
back
goods
in
will
the
be
day,
stickier than others.
you'd have to have some way of judging these
Now, by
these
contrast,
differences.
an
You know,
industry like
sure,
gasoline
this modern product's
is
a lot more
very
expensive.
responsive.
I'm talking about
I
when
think
it
I
did
already
when
brought
new,
up the
right?
Colonial Pipeline
It's a lot more
shutdown.
expensive,
I saw
but
it
it
with
has
my own eyes.
all
I
this
survived it.
functionality that the old version didn't used to
Gasoline
have.
normally sits around 230
Same thing with things
nowadays,
like phones.
but for
The
one
smartphone market has
horrible
gone
day,
completely insane.
it
You've
shot
got
up to
Apple
10.
charging over $1,000 for a
Shot
phone
up
now.
before my eyes.
But the phones are genuinely a lot better.
And then it was gone the very next day. Well, that almost seems like the
they didn't
opposite
used to
of
have
the
CPUs that big. They didn't
restaurant
used to have
situation.
GPUs that big.
Why
You
would they
didn't,
be
you didn't
willing to
used to be
change
able
the
to use
price
your
just to revert it
phone
back
like
so
it was
quickly?
a little gaming computer.
And the answer is very simple. It was free for them to do it.
I remember my
It
first
didn't cost
smartphone
the
equivalent was
restaurant
actually
anything,
an
or
iPod,
it didn't cost
and
the
it
gas
had
station anything to change the price.
it had.
Because what are gas station prices listed on? They're
So
listed
my
on
first
electronic
equivalent
billboards,
to
and they're listed
smartphone
on
was
the
this
electronic pumps.
iPod. I don't remember what they called it, iPod Touch.
They can
maybe.
just go in and type in a
But
different
the
price.
big idea was it had
And there's
Wi-Fi.
actually government
You could actually
regulations
use the
that
internet
forbid
on
them
it.
from changing the prices too frequently.
It didn't have cell service. so that was actually very,
This
very
is going to have a
limited
big
in
impact
usefulness. But it had Wi-Fi.
on goods. And
And
then
of
you
course,
get into
that was
other
a
problems too.
huge
Like, for
innovation
example,
over
this
the
goes back to
original
restaurants
iPod,
mostly,
which
but
had
when
no,
you have a brand that is heavily
no
associated with a
Wi-Fi at
specific
all,
price,
had no touch screen,
you sell a staple good,
was just a music player.
people are
that was it.
very accustomed to buying it every day at the same price. Or when you have a marketing
The
campaign,
nature of a product can change
you have
dramatically over
poured a
time.
ton of money
I don't think they
into
even
selling
sell
this
iPods
idea.
anymore.
$5 footlongs,
But you have to have some way of
dollar
dealing with
menu,
that. If you want your inflation statistics to mean
so on
anything,
and so forth.
you have to be able to
Well, you can't just casually
try to put a
change the
dollar
price,
value on the improvements
because it
in the
undermines your
technology.
advertising, and it
Because
runs the
otherwise
risk of
it's going to
consumer
make inflation
backlash.
look a lot worse than it
Consumers
really
are
is.
very entitled people,
The flip side of this is that sometimes
and they
products do get
will
worse.
and do freak out when prices.
I think usually when you talk about technology, it gets better. When you talk about
this is going to have an
manufacturers, it gets
impact on
worse
the way
'cause,
inflation
you're buying
spreads.
Chinese
The money's
garbage.
circulating around.
Stuff isn't durable
circulates
anymore.
to some places
That's
earlier
intentional
than
in
others.
part. They call it planned obsolescence.
But in terms of its impact
sell
on
people
driving up the
something-
price,
actually,
that's
Apple-
also going to move
Apple got
faster in some places
dinged
than
by the
others,
government over that.
largely
and they-
based on they were artificially
how
throttling their battery's
expensive
lifespan
it is
to change the prices,
make a thing wear out faster,
and
just
how
so they can
poorly
sell
the
you
consumers are going
replacement.
to take it. Now, a little more significant for your
Well,
lives
A similar problem that you run into
is the role that
when
contracts
completely
play.
new products emerge.
This is going to have a huge
So,
impact. It has an
products
impact on
improve
producers,
over
and it
time.
has an impact on
For
workers.
the most part, they improve over time.
You
Sometimes you also get
contract
products
for
that
good
at a
really just
specific
have
price,
no equivalent in the past.
and then inflation
So,
begins
for example,
to take off.
what would you consider
But you
a
can't get out of your
computer in
contract.
2000?
There's
There's
always
always
a way to get out of a
What would be
contract, but
its
you can't
equivalent
just
in 1900?
Stop buying from that producer.
or
are you going to compare it to an abacus
purchaser
because it's a
or
calculating
working
machine?
at that workplace?
Are you going to compare it to
In any
a
situation
newspaper
where you have
because it provides
a large presence
know,
of contracts,
access
you
to
can
to
expect sticky
information?
prices to be much,
Are you going
much
to
worse.
compare it to an entire private
And
library?
this is especially going to impact workers.
Is
And this
it
is going to be the
equivalent to
entire reason
tickets
why
at
inflation
a
is painful
playhouse
for
because
workers.
it puts on shows? Because you
So
can
I've already shown
stream
you the argument
movies
that in
on
the
it?
long run, inflation doesn't affect anything.
Is it
But
equivalent
we know
to
that
having a
it's
secretary?
very, very unpleasant in the short run.
Is it equivalent to having
And
an
why?
accountant because it can run Microsoft
Because
Excel?
even though our incomes do
You
eventually
see the
go
problem.
up,
The
they
computer
have
is
to go
unique
up.
because the computer doesn't just
That's
perform
part
a
of the
certain set of
neutrality of
tasks.
money. Labor is
Its
a service
ability
like
to
anything
do
else.
any of these tasks makes it more than just the sum of its
Wages
parts.
have to go up, but they don't go up as fast
On the other hand, you might look
as
back
the
into
prices
the
of
past,
goods do.
take things that we don't buy much of nowadays, and ask
And
where
so
they
we
would
end
fit
up
in.
losing in the short term.
Like for a horse, the obvious thing would
And
be to
why
equate a
do
horse with a
wages
car.
increase
They're
slower?
both transportation.
Well, for
at
the
the end of
most
the day.
part, they increase slower due to
But most people that are
contracts
buying
and also due to the
know,
job search process.
horses nowadays, they're not using them as transportation, they're using them as an entertainment tool.
Because hiring a worker is such a big decision for a company, even for a large
And even
company,
just a change in perspective can change how we view
they
a
don't
good.
do it casually.
If you're trying to measure
And
GDP
so
in the
people,
distant
especially
past, do
professional
you
types,
compare
they expect to
organic
spend
food
months
then to
on the
organic
job
food now,
market
or do you
looking for a
compare
job.
it to regular food now? Everything in
And
the
if you
past
just
used to be
walk
organic,
away from a job without fulfilling your
but that didn't mean
obligations to
anything
it,
to them. It was organic because
that's
they
not
didn't
going to
have
look good to that
inorganic,
next employer.
fertilizers yet.
And depending on the nature
They
of
wouldn't
your
put
work,
any
you might
value
even
on
be responsible for civil damages. There are ways
If you walked
that
away from a
economists
task,
you
you
were
try to get
obligated to
around this,
complete,
and one of the main ways
costs
is
the company
through what's called
because of that.
chaining. You basically come up with a different index for each
People
year,
tend to be stuck.
and then
You can
for
easily
every year you take a
buy
weighted
less
average
of something,
of all the different indices.
but you can't just easily walk
So
away from your
you might
workplace
say,
and
well, we'll
walk
give a
into
weight
another
of
one.
1 to this year's bundle of goods,
And because of
and
this,
then
inflation
we'll
is going to
count
be
at like
easier
95%
not
next
just
year's
on
bundle of goods, and then so
producers
on and so forth.
than it is on
So that
on
for every
employees,
year, every
but it's
other
also
year
going to
gets a
be
little bit of
easier
say,
on some
but
kinds
it's
of
weighted
workers
towards
than on
years that
others.
are closer.
As a rule, businessmen are
And
going
that's
to be
one
the
way that
people that
they do
benefit
this,
most
because that
from
allows for a
inflation.
sort of gradual shading.
And that can
you
either
know
mean
that
they
the
are hurt
product
the
mix
least by
has to change.
inflation,
You know that the quantity
or that
has to change.
they actually do
But
literally
that can help
benefit
to
from it.
smooth out some of the awkwardness of it. It's difficult to do correctly, though.
Sell a product,
And
that's at
in
the
the
very
end, a lot of growth
start of
economists,
that ripple effect.
that's my
that's
main
at the
field.
start of that
A
chain
lot of growth
reaction.
economists do economic
Then
history
you get
work
to
where
reap the benefits of all those extra sales.
they'll have some data set
without
and
having
say,
to
"Oh,
pay
this
higher
was what the
prices on
price level
everything
was
yourself.
back in
The
ancient
inflation has
Rome, and
just
this is
begun.
what
It
it is
hasn't
now."
circulated fully yet.
It's bullshit. Nobody knows. You can't.
So businesses can often,
meaningfully put together a data set that covers
make
that
a
much
make a
time.
tidy little profit off of this stuff.
Inflation measurement works very well when you're comparing
Wage
year to
slaves?
year. It's decent
Usually
if you're comparing
they,
like from decade to decade. But I'd
I
say
mean,
when you go beyond 50
they're at the
years,
bottom of
it
the
all just
social
kind of
pyramid,
breaks
aren't
down.
they?
It's not.
Burger flippers,
I don't take any of that stuff seriously.
janitors, unskilled labor in general.
Now, in the modern world, the price
Now you would
level is
expect
pretty
that
much
inflation would hit
always
them
going up.
especially hard because
We're
they
always
have very
inflating
low
the
incomes.
currency. It wasn't always true,
But they do have
under
one
the
thing
gold
going for
standard
them.
and specie.
Because their work is
deflation was
unskilled,
common.
it doesn't really cost them anything.
Most
to
of the
just leave them
time,
behind.
population grew faster
And
than
there's
the
there's
known
always
gold
somebody in
reserves
this
did.
world looking
And
for another
so
burger flipper.
the currency would deflate and price levels would actually go down. Amazing as it was to see
In a
that
modern
$10
age
a
of
gallon
cash
gas
and
in
budget
Central,
deficits,
it was
though,
also amazing to see
government doesn't
$15
let
an
that
hour wages being paid by
And so
the fast
because
food
of this,
places.
nominal prices, wages, and
So it used to
GDP
be everybody was
from
making
before the base year are
$7.25.
usually
If you
going
flip
to
burgers
be
for a living, you're making minimum wage.
understated,
And of course, you're only
whereas
making
nominal
minimum wage
prices,
because
wages, and
it's the
GDP
minimum
from
wage.
after the base
If they
year
would
will
take
be
that away, they'd be
overstated.
getting $3, and they deserve
Right?
it too.
If you're comparing everything
Your
to the
average
base year,
fast
then
food worker,
before the
in my
base year, when the price
experience,
levels are
is
lower, that's
a
going to make
druggie,
things look
a
worse.
degenerate.
Or
Of
if you're
course, you
talking
also
about
have your people
prices,
who
it
are
would
just
definitely make
doing
it look
it
better than it was.
as a temporary job. You know, they're in between jobs
After the
or
base
it's a
year, it's
part-time
going
job
to
like
make it look
college, but higher than it really is. And both of these
There's a
problems are going
reason
to
why
get
they're
worse
paid
the
so
further
little.
you go back or forward in time.
So
Well,
you
along comes
always
COVID
want
and
to use
screws the
real
whole world up.
statistics.
I say COVID screws the world up. The COVID
Always,
lockdown screwed the
anytime
world up.
you look
The
up
COVID
wages,
stimulus bill
GDP
screwed the world
prices,
up.
whatever it is you're
And
doing
they
it
just
for, make
dump
sure that it's the real numbers.
money
The
on the
nominal
economy,
numbers don't mean
double the
anything.
monetary base.
But I have an example of this here with GDP.
Suddenly,
This
the
is
prices of everything
from
start
roughly
skyrocketing.
1950
They're
to
offering
2015
extremely generous welfare to
for
people.
the U.S.
And so the wages
Red
decide,
is
you know,
your gross domestic product.
I don't really
nominal.
want to work.
If it doesn't say real, assume it's nominal.
And who can blame them?
Blue is real. And so you see,
the equilibrium
looks like they're using
price of a
2012
burger
as their
flipper had
base year.
increased dramatically. And so they had to start offering them higher wages.
Before
And
that
any
point,
drive-through you go through,
the real
they all
GDP is
advertise this. They
higher
all, you know,
than the
they all
nominal
have flyers
GDP
up in the windows begging people to come work for them for
because the
$15 an hour. Twice what they used
prices
to make.
were lower. So if you don't
And yet they
adjust
still
for
struggle to get
prices,
the
it's
workers
going to make the
because that's
economy look
still
poorer than
a
it was.
shitty deal.
But after 2012, after the base year,
But the
real
thing
GDP is lower
those
than
folks,
nominal GDP. If you didn't do
they
the
have that
inflation
ability.
adjustment,
They have that market
you would
power
be
that you know.
over.
If you don't like your job at Wendy's, you'll just run over to Taco Bell. If you don't like your job
You'll
at
also
Taco
notice
Bell,
that
you'll
with
go work
both
for
of
Cookout.
these, they're increasing over time.
Because they're so interchangeable,
But with the nominal GDP,
it's
it looks
easy
like
to
more
find
of an
another
exponential
job,
increase.
which ends up giving them quite
the
a
real
bit
GDP,
of
it's smoother.
bargaining power. Burger Flipper's not going to bargain themselves into a
On the right-hand
$50
side,
an hour,
just to show you, we've got
wage,
nominal
but
wages and real wages.
they could bargain themselves into a wage increase at a time when other
You see
people
nominal
couldn't.
wages keep shooting up and up and up.
So people at the low end,
Way back in 1947, people are
of the
literally
income
making $1
distribution,
an hour.
they suffered more from inflation
Nowadays,
in the very short
well,
term,
actually, that's 2002, so
because
it's gone up even more since then.
it's harder
But
to cut back.
about 20 years ago, making like 15 an hour.
You have people that
This is
live,
average across the whole country.
paycheck to paycheck that can't cut back.
But the real wage
But
didn't move near
their
as much.
salvation, their incomes going up.
From the 50s,
Their wage
the 50s were
increases
kind of
came
America's
much faster.
economic golden age. From the 50s up to the 70s, there was some really solid
Likewise,
growth.
you would expect inflation to be easier on
Not quite a
self-employed
doubling of
tradesmen and
people's
professionals.
wages, but still, quite respectable.
People who work a wage or who
I want to draw your
contract
attention
on
to the
their
fact
own,
that that's zero,
but they're
at
skilled
the
labor.
bottom. So
they make good, incomes. Have
you're
high
talking
earnings.
within living memory. My pa was
You're
born
talking
in 46.
electricians, plumbers,
Within living memory, people are going from
potentially a lot of factory
$5
workers
to around like
who have
$9.
some specific skill, like welders.
But then the 70s come, and there was a very bad patch
People
of
that might be
inflation,
working for
followed
an
by
employer, but
globalization.
they have a rare skill that's
Where
in
does the
such
growth
high
go?
demand that they could easily find another factory. And of course, people
American
like your lawyers and
unions
doctors
were at their
and
high
stuff, too.
point in the 70s. The U.S. had a very
if you set your own
strong
wages,
labor
or if you have a
movement,
lot of bargaining power,
all the way from the New Deal,
because you have
up to the
a
70s.
niche that's in high demand, then
And
inflation's not gonna
America
hurt you as
also
much.
had
you would
its
expect
own
their incomes to be
manufacturing
less
back
sticky.
then. And there was no
But the
mass
class
immigration.
that really gets screwed over by inflation is sort
So
of
workers
your,
had very
your
little
middle
competition.
class white collar workers.
And that meant that they got to reap
people
most of the
that don't
benefits of
have
their
a
own work.
specific technical skill
The
like the
70s
tradesmen
come,
do,
you get dramatic inflation. The
and
80s and
who are
90s come,
salarymen,
you get massive globalization.
they're kind of stuck
with their employer for a year at
You
a
get
time.
masses of illegals flooding in from the southern border. You get masses of
And
factories
who can't just easily find
flooding
another
out of the
job.
country.
They might have a narrow
exploit
niche,
cheap
but it's
Asian
not a
labor.
narrow niche that lends itself to them just walking away.
I want to draw your attention to
You
something
don't just
here.
boldly
Notice how the real
stride out into the
GDP
job
per
market and say,
capita
okay, who wants to hire
continued to
me?
soar.
You know,
See how it shot up.
it was that white collar
that's
middle
not per
class
capita.
that really got
That's just
cheated by all of
GDP.
this.
I wish I'd put GDP per capita there. Still, notice how the economy continued to
I got cheated by
expand
all of this.
massively over that period.
Graduate students,
Yet
may
regular
be one of
folks'
the
living standards
stickiest
didn't go up
kinds
at
of
all.
employees in the world because we cannot transfer our credit to other schools.
Who'd it go to? It went to the
So,
rich.
in the past 5 years,
Rich grabbed it all up.
I've gotten $500 in raises.
And they used
It's horrible.
foreigners.
And of course, that's part of
deunionization
the
to do it.
rules of the game. You understand when you
If you're on the
take
right
a
wing, I
job
want you
like
to
that,
understand
that you have to be
the
planning
death
based on the
of
inflation
the
you
unions
expect
is also the
to
death
happen.
of the working class in this country.
But if the inflation
if
happens
you're on the left wing,
unexpectedly,
think
then
through
yeah,
it.
you just get screwed over.
Is more competition from foreign workers, whether they live in the U.S. or outside, going to
So,
help
how do we
workers
measure
here?
inflation?
No. Now, there are different indices for different purposes. For converting nominal GDP to real GDP, the government uses what's called the GDP deflator. And for consumers' cost of living, the government uses the Consumer Price Index. And these are both based on the same idea. You're going to pick a year or a period. Normally, we're talking a year at a time. You're going to pick, well, they do calculate this month to month. The point is, you're going to pick a period of time to look at, and you use that as your base month, your base year, whatever it may be. And then you pick a bundle of goods representative of normal expenses, and you measure the ratio of how much it increased. Often we like to use the metaphor of a shopping cart. If you imagine a typical shopping cart, you know, a typical like week's worth of groceries and other household supplies, with a little bit of rent thrown in, with a little bit of utilities and so on and so forth. We're measuring the change in the shopping cart because the shopping cart has proportions for each good that are representative of, you know, a normal person's purchases. And the only difference between this GDP deflator and this consumer price index is that the GDP deflator is going to include things like raw materials and capital. It includes stuff that producers care about. The consumer price index is specifically for consumers, products that you would go and buy in a store. Now, example of this being calculated. Suppose your bundle in 2023 is 3 baubles, 2 gewgaws, and 1 gadget at $10, $20, and $5 each. And so in 2023, that should say, in 2023, the bundle will be $75. In 2024, the prices change. Baubles skyrocket to $15. Gewgaws actually fall to $16, and gadgets go up to $8. And so if we take the same amounts, 3 baubles at 15, 3 at 15, 2 at 16, and 1 at 8, then 15 times 3 plus 16 times 2 plus 8 comes out to 85. And then if you divide 85 by 75, you get 1.13. The inflation index for 2024 is 1.13. And this is basically telling you, if you want to buy the same goods in 2024, like if you were to spend $1 in 2023, it would take you $1.13 to get the same goods in 2024. And you would say that the inflation rate is 13%. So it's this thought experiment. How much money would I have to have now to buy the same things I used to be able to buy? Now, like measuring GDP, measuring inflation is going to be fraught with problems. The bundle people buys changes over time. It can change in part just due to changes in taste. Things come in and out of fashion. People want different kinds of products. For the most part, this isn't going to be a big deal because the bundle is abstract enough to account for that. They're targeting kind of broad categories of goods, and you don't see huge shifts in broad categories of goods. People don't suddenly develop a taste for a lot more housing or a lot more entertainment, for example. But it can be a lot more difficult to try to quantify changes in quality. You'll have an item that's more expensive, for example, but is it more expensive due to inflation, or is it more expensive because it's better technology? So with automobiles, for example, you can kind of make cases in either direction with those. Modern cars are a lot safer. Modern cars have a lot better mileage than they used to. A lot of modern cars have electronics built in. You know, they'll have little TVs in the back seats. They'll come with GPS maps built directly into it. They'll have the self-driving capabilities. Those are all things that your old cars didn't have. Biggest downside is that the old cars looked a heck of a lot better. So if you were to compare the price of a, Cadillac today to a Cadillac back in the day, you'd have to have some way of judging these differences. This modern product's a lot more expensive. I'm talking about when it would have been bought new, right? It's a lot more expensive, but it has all of this functionality that the old version didn't used to have. Same thing with things like phones. The smartphone market has gone completely insane. You've got Apple charging over $1,000 for a phone now. But the phones are genuinely a lot better. They didn't used to have CPUs that big. They didn't used to have GPUs that big. You didn't used to be able to use your phone like it was a little gaming computer. I remember my first smartphone equivalent was actually an iPod, and it had it had so my first equivalent to a smartphone was this iPod. I don't remember what they called it, iPod Touch maybe. But the big idea was it had Wi-Fi. You could actually use the internet on it. It didn't have cell service. So that was actually very, very limited in usefulness. But it had Wi-Fi. And of course, that was a huge innovation over the original iPod, which had no Wi-Fi at all, had no touch screen, was just a music player. That was it. The nature of a product can change dramatically over time. I don't think they even sell iPods anymore. But you have to have some way of dealing with that. If you want your inflation statistics to mean anything, you have to be able to try to put a dollar value on the improvements in the technology. Because otherwise it's going to make inflation look a lot worse than it really is. The flip side of this is that sometimes products do get worse. I think usually when you talk about technology, it gets better. When you talk about manufacturers, it gets worse because, you're buying Chinese garbage. Stuff isn't durable anymore. That's intentional in part. They call it planned obsolescence. They'll sell people something. Actually, Apple got dinged by the government over that, and they were artificially throttling their batteries' lifespans, make a thing wear out faster just so they can sell you the replacement. Well, a similar problem that you run into is when completely new products emerge. So products improve over time. For the most part, they improve over time. But sometimes you also get products that really just have no equivalent in the past. So for example, what would you consider a computer in 2000? Take a computer in 2000. What would be its equivalent in 1900? Are you going to compare it to an abacus because it's a calculating machine? Are you going to compare it to a newspaper because it provides, access to information? Are you going to compare it to an entire private library? Is it equivalent to tickets at a playhouse because it puts on shows because you can stream movies on it? Is it equivalent to having a secretary? Is it equivalent to having an accountant because it can run Microsoft Excel? You see the problem. A computer is unique because a computer doesn't just perform a certain set of tasks. Its ability to do any of these tasks makes it more than just the sum of its parts. On the other hand, you might look back into the past, take things that we don't buy much of nowadays, and ask where they would fit in. Like for a horse, the obvious thing would be to equate a horse with a car. They're both transportation at the end of the day. But most people that are buying, horses nowadays, they're not using them as transportation. They're using them as an entertainment good. And even just a change in perspective can change how we view a good. If you're trying to measure GDP in the distant past, do you compare organic food then to organic food now, or do you compare it to regular food now? Everything in the past used to be organic, but that didn't mean anything to them. It was organic because they didn't have inorganic, fertilizers yet. They wouldn't have put any value on it. There are ways that economists can try to get around this, and one of the main ways is through what's called chaining. You basically come up with a different index for each year. And then for every year, you take a weighted average of all the different indices. So you might say, well, we'll give a weight of 1 to this year's bundle of goods, and then we'll count at like 95% the next year's bundle of goods, and then so on and so forth. So that for every year, every other year gets a little bit of say, but it's weighted towards years that are closer. And that's one way that they do this, because that allows for a sort of gradual shading. You know that the product mix has to change, you know that the quantity has to change. But that can help to smooth out some of the awkwardness of it. It's difficult to do correctly, though. And in the end, a lot of growth economists, that's my main field, a lot of growth economists do economic history work where they'll have some data set and they'll say, oh, this was what the price level was back in ancient Rome, and this is what it is now. It's bullshit.
Nobody knows. You can't meaningfully put together a data set that covers that much time. Inflation measurement works very well when you're comparing year to year. It's decent if you're comparing like from decade to decade. But I'd say when you go beyond 50 years, it all just kind of breaks down. It's not, I don't take any of that stuff seriously. Now, in the modern world, the price level is pretty much always going up. We're always inflating the currency. It wasn't always true. Under the gold standard and specie, deflation was common. Most of the time, population grew faster than the known gold reserves did. And so the currency would deflate, price levels would actually go down. In a modern age of cash and budget deficits, though, government doesn't let that happen. And so because of this, nominal prices, wages, and GDP from before the base year are usually going to be understated, whereas nominal prices, wages, and GDP from after the base year will be overstated. Right? If you're comparing everything to the base year, then before the base year, when the price levels are lower, that's going to make things look worse. Or if you're talking about prices, it would actually make it look better than it was. After the base year, it's going to make it look higher than it really is. And both of these problems are going to get worse the further you go back or forward in time. So you always want to use real statistics. Always, anytime you look up wages, GDP, prices, whatever it is you're doing it for, make sure that it's the real numbers. The nominal numbers don't mean anything. But I have an example of this here with GDP. This is from roughly 1950 to 2015 for the US. Red is your gross domestic product, nominal. If it doesn't say real, assume it's nominal. Blue is real. And so you see, looks like they're using 2012 as their base year. Before that point, the real GDP is higher than the nominal GDP because the prices were lower. So if you don't adjust for prices, it's going to make the economy look poorer than it was. But after 2012, after the base year, real GDP is lower than nominal GDP. If you didn't do the inflation adjustment, you would be over predicting. You'll also notice that with both of these, they're increasing over time. But with the nominal GDP, it looks like more of an exponential increase. With the real GDP, it's smoother. On the right-hand side, just to show you, we've got nominal wages and real wages. You see nominal wages keep shooting up and up and up. Way back in 1947, people are literally making $1 an hour. Nowadays, well, actually, that's 2002, so it's gone up even more since then. But about 20 years ago, making like 15 an hour. This is average across the whole country. But the real wage didn't move near as much. From the 50s, you know, the 50s were kind of America's economic golden age. From the 50s up to the 70s, there was some really solid growth. Not quite a doubling of people's wages, but still, you know, quite respectable. I want to draw your attention to the fact that that's zero at the bottom. So you're talking within living memory. My pa was born in 46. Within living memory, people are going from, you know, $5 to around like $9. But then the 70s come and
There was a very bad patch of inflation followed by globalization. Where does the growth go? American unions were at their high point in the 70s. The US had a very strong labor movement all the way from the New Deal up through the 70s. And America also had its own manufacturing back then. And there was no mass immigration. So workers had very little competition. And that meant that they got to reap most of the benefits of their own work. The 70s come, you get dramatic inflation. The 80s and 90s come, you get massive globalization. You get masses of illegals flooding in from the southern border. You get masses of factories flooding out of the country to exploit cheap Asian labor. I want to draw your attention to something here. Notice how the real GDP per capita continued to soar. See how it shot up? Oh, that's not per capita. That's just GDP. I wish I'd put GDP per capita there. Still, notice how the economy continued to expand massively over that period. Yet regular folks' living standards didn't go up at all. Who'd it go to? It went to the rich. Rich grabbed it all up. And they used foreigners and deunionization to do it. If you're on the right wing, I want you to understand the death of the unions was also the death of the working class in this country. If you're on the left wing, think through it. Is more competition from foreign workers, whether they live in the U.S. or outside, going to help workers here? No. Now, how we measure inflation is also how we measure cost of living between places. So instead of picking a base year, you pick a base year and place pair. Usually we're talking about countries. So a year and country. And use that for your index. And very often it'll either be, depending on how old the data is, they'll either be measuring things in 1970 US or 2000 US. And the unit of measurement will be called international dollars. Sometimes you also hear them called Gary Kamas dollars after the two economists that developed this, but international dollars. Translating everything into a cost of living, comparable to the United States. And the concept is called purchasing power parity. And because poorer countries tend to have lower PPP indices, the adjustment mostly reduces the gaps between countries. You'll hear about some hellhole that has a GDP of like $500 a year, GDP per capita, $500. A lot of people swallow those statistics without thinking about it. I've always thought there's no way there's actually countries that poor. My rent is $900. I cannot buy the idea that someone living in a shack in Botswana is actually, that everything they consume, just the food alone that they eat over the course of a year, is worth less than my apartment. Well, that's another case of statistics lying, because firstly, remember, we talked about how subsistence agriculture doesn't get counted in GDP. Countries like that don't tend to have effective governments capable of collecting the statistics at all. So a huge chunk of their economy is black market. And you also get this cost of living. If you don't look at PPP, then it doesn't mean anything. But to illustrate the kind of impact this has, we're going to look at the US. This is with regional pricing parity. So each state has its own cost of living index calculated. Now, on this graph, it shades from black for the poorest state through red, yellow, green, up to a dark green for the richest state. Now, when we look at just GDP per capita, you'll probably quickly notice some regional patterns. The South is poor, New England is rich, and the West Coast is rich. And then it kind of looks like the middle of the country. The West and Great Plains might be a little bit better off than the Midwest. Our richest state is Massachusetts, and our poorest state is Mississippi. Everyone say it with me now. Thank God for Mississippi. Now, what happens when we add in regional pricing parity? Well, some aspects of the pattern stay the same, but some of it changes notably. After doing regional pricing parity, we see that the South is still relatively poor, but it's not as poor as before. Some parts are still doing rather miserable. South Carolina, Appalachia, Mississippi. But some parts improve notably. Tennessee comes out looking a lot better. Oklahoma comes out looking a lot better. In the Northeast, well, several of these states are just as wealthy as before, but some of them aren't. Vermont, expensive place to live. Maine, very expensive. Rhode Island, expensive. Where it really makes a difference, though, is in the interior of the country and in the West Coast. Suddenly, the interior starts to look really good. South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa. You got these places that don't have very large incomes on paper. But when you consider how cheap it is to live there, they're wealthy. I have more graphs. I don't teach inequality in this class, but when you look at inequality, it gets even better because there's a lot of inequality in the North and in the West, but there's not much in the interior West. Wyoming is probably the best place in the country from a standpoint of quality of life for the average person. And that West Coast, jeez, look at how bad it is. California goes from being a top-tier state to being a mid-tier state. California, let me put it this way. California becomes the equivalent of a Louisiana in terms of living standards. Oregon, poor. Nevada, poor. Washington, actually still wealthy, but not as wealthy as it was. And worst of all, this one is crazy. Hawaii goes from like the 10s to 20s range of richest states down to the very bottom. They're like number 2 next to Mississippi. Hawaii has this reputation for being a paradise, God knows why, but it's everything they buy has to be hauled in from across the Pacific Ocean. It's like a little third world banana republic stapled onto the US. And that's more or less how it came to join us anyways. American fruit companies went in, couped the government, and then petitioned for annexation. It's a banana republic that we ate. If you're ever moving to someplace, I hope you have the good sense to look up the cost of living. Now, before concluding this section, there are a few other terms to introduce. Deflation refers to a decrease in the price level. Negative inflation, basically. Yeah, and I already told you, this was common under specie. Disinflation refers to a reduction in the inflation rate. You're going to hear that term a lot in the Keynesianism lectures.
So deflation, the prices are going down. Disinflation, they're still going up. They're just not going up as fast. The inflation is slowing. It's starting to ease off. Hyperinflation refers to inflation occurring so rapidly that the currency breaks down, and seigniorage refers to the profits a money creator takes from inflation. So when inflation rates are predictable, people will account for that in their demand and supply. But sometimes governments get in a bind. They can't raise enough taxes or borrow enough to stay afloat. And this is usually caused by war or revolution. Pretty much every time a country has a revolution, it winds up hyperinflating. It even happened to us when we had ours. There was an expression, not worth a continental, in reference to how worthless the US dollar was. And what the government does is it resorts to seigniorage, creating the funds out of thin air. Now, I already told you how, fiat currency, as we know it, was created by the World Wars. If I can't steal money from people directly, I'm just going to make more money and steal from them in that way. And one way you might think of it is if you have if money acts as like points to make a claim on society's resources, if I have 10% of the money in the world, I can claim 10% of society's value. What inflating does for the government is it just increases their share. It doesn't make the pie any bigger, but it gives them a larger slice by cutting down on everyone else's. And they're going to be able to spend the money before the prices have even gone up. So it's especially attractive to them. So you're in a situation, war, revolution, scary plague running amok, and you decide to just start printing, cash. If you do this to repay debts, it's called monetizing the debt, which is an especially dirty deed. You owe somebody money, so you give them payment, but your payment cheapens the value of the very money you gave them, so you've effectively cheated that person. But it creates a vicious cycle because the inflation caused by the seigniorage means the government has to print even more next time, right? You do this once. The only reason you did this, the only reason you really want to do seigniorage is because you can't collect enough money to fund your government. You do it, you fund your government for a period. Now it's more expensive to fund the government in the future, which means you have to resort to even more inflation. And it just spirals out of control. If it's bad enough, if a government fails to put the brakes on it in time, it spirals out of control as they're forced to print ever escalating amounts of money. And if the inflation rate is high enough, the currency becomes impractical as a store of value. You get a paycheck and it's worthless by the very next day. And if the amount of currency needed is also large enough, then it's going to be impractical as a means of exchange. You might have heard the story about Weimar Germany. This was Germany between the world wars. They had lost World War I, and the Allies put very punitive reparations on them. They were expected to pay for everyone else's bills. And the Germans, they hadn't put any plan into how they were going to fund the war anyways. They actually intended to do the exact same thing to the Allies. And they never planned to comply with this in the first place. So what did the Germans do? Print money. Print and print and print. And eventually it reached a point that people were literally having to lug around entire wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy groceries. A reading from Lords of Finance. The Bankers Who Broke the World.
On November 12th, the Reichsmark was trading at 630 billion to the dollar. Some argued that the rate of conversion should be fixed at that point, but shocked, the German central bank director decided to wait. The black market price was still falling, and he wished to allow the selling to exhaust itself before he committed to a rate of conversion. Every day the Reichsmark plunged further, and every day he insisted on holding back. On November 14, when it fell to 1.3 trillion, he did nothing. A day later, it was at 2.5 trillion, and still he sat on his hands. Finally, on November 20th, when the Reichsmark stood, if that is the word, at 4.2 trillion to the dollar, he fixed the conversion rate at 1 trillion Reichsmarks to a Rentenmark. From 630 billion to a dollar to 4.2 trillion to a dollar in 7 days. Imagine, loosely speaking, right? I'm estimating. Imagine having the value of your savings be cut to 1/8 in a week. 1/8 in a week. There's all kinds of crazy stories from out of Weimar Germany. And there have been a ton of nations over the years that have hyperinflated. You've probably heard of billion-dollar bills from Zimbabwe. You've probably heard of similar, excesses in Venezuela. One story I heard of Weimar Germany out of that same book had to do with the American expatriates who got stuck in Germany. I don't remember why they were stuck. The Nazis weren't in power yet, so it wasn't that. But so some of these American tourists end up getting stranded, and they're there right as the hyperinflation begins to take off, right as the currency begins to break down. And when a currency breaks down like that, everybody wants to exchange it for a currency that isn't in a free fall. You know that if you save your money, it's going to be worthless the next day. You're going to be this poor sucker. So you had better exchange it for something else as soon as you can. You need to invest it in something that's going to keep its value. And oftentimes that something is another nation's currency. And so Americans who were holding American dollars, they had a field day with it. There's stories of regular Americans, the kind of people who nowadays would be like walking on foot from hostel to hostel, renting out entire symphony orchestras to do private performances for them for the price of what would have bought dinner back home, because the currency was breaking down that much. People were that desperate to get their hands on American dollars that they would pay any price for it. There's tales of workers gathering together when it was payday, and the prices had escalated so much, and with it the wages had gone up so much that people were actually throwing employers were throwing sacks full of cash down to them as their pay. They're not even measuring it, because there's no point in measuring it. It wouldn't matter if there was a 1,000,000 mark bill in that bag, because it's going to be worthless by the next day anyways. So they're just stuffing sacks. They're measuring it by the sack. And the boss would throw it down to the workers from the second floor, and then the workers would solemnly run off to the store as fast as they can to spend it as fast as they can, so that they don't have to run back and get another sack because the prices have gone up again. There's a sort of insanity to hyperinflation. Even though economics likes to take this rational view of people, I don't see any rationality in that kind of behavior. People are set in their ways. Remember, the value of any currency, as we discussed, the value of any currency, but especially fiat currency, depends on faith. And that means that a currency can break down spectacularly when people stop believing in it. But people can also believe in something long after it deserves to be believed in. You'd think that those fellows with the sacks of cash would have just given up on it and taken their payment in something else. Pay me bread. But people are set in their habits. They'll cling to the institutions of life long after they make sense. Any currency can be hyperinflated. We talked about Mansa Musa's Hajj, hyperinflating gold. It can happen with anything, but fiat currency specifically is vulnerable to it. With all of those other currencies, they are pegged to something real, or in the case of cryptocurrency, there's no known way to just up and print up more of it. There's no way to counterfeit it. Fiat is dangerous because the only thing that stops a government from hyperinflating is it not wanting to. And there's no magic formula that tells you when a thing will hyperinflate or when it has hyperinflated. People like to quibble about definitions. I avoid giving you formal definitions for this stuff because it doesn't matter. If prices on everything doubled over the course of 1 year, that would kill most people, even if it wasn't hyperinflation. If you were like 1 percentage point below the definition, it'd make no more difference to you than if you were 1 percentage point above it. What makes it hyperinflation is qualitative. It's that situation where the function of the currency no longer works. The currency can't do its job. People don't trust the currency anymore. And so they no longer value it. People don't accept it as payment. People make kites out of money. They wallpaper their houses with money. They use money as toilet paper because the money is doomed. It's lost so much value that it's never coming back. And usually people will then switch to some sort of spontaneous commodity currency. Because you can't run a modern society on barter. And people are very good at, it's called spontaneous order. Even without active government intervention, people are very good at creating new social conventions and new institutions all on their own. Usually the new commodity currency is either going to be liquor or it's going to be some kind of food stuff for the reasons we discussed back in the currency lectures. But it always happens. People always find a way. But it can cause a lot of damage in the short term. Now, what keeps inflation in check? Well, for the money issuer, seigniorage is like another type of taxation. If you're constantly inflating, then prices are always being driven up, and the government is constantly earning seigniorage. And as long as we, keep using this tax metaphor, and it is like a tax because you know that you're not going to reap the full benefit of your work if some of that's going to get stolen from you in the form of inflation. Well, then there's going to be a Laffer curve for seigniorage profits. The government's going to understand that if they raise inflation too much, that it acts as a disincentive to work, then it might actually lower their take. And the government also understands that if they hyperinflate, their own currency will be worthless. They'll have killed the golden goose.
Once you've done it once, it's really hard to get people to trust you again. Brazil had an ordeal with that recently. They had to do this very gradual rollout of a new currency because they had to demonstrate to their own people that they weren't going to hyperinflate it again. And that's hard to do when people won't take your new currency seriously because you have to fund your government somehow. But in general, hyperinflation is a last resort of a failing government. It's not something that governments want to do. It's something that they have to do when they've put themselves in an unwinnable situation. Inflation is an increase in the general price level caused by an increase in the money supply relative to real output. It's measured by tracking the change in price of a bundle of goods. Fractional reserve banking creates money by loaning out more than the bank reserves, the rate being called the money multiplier. And when this fails, it causes a bank run. Everyone flocks to the bank and Mayday, Mayday. 1, 2, 3. So in conclusion, inflation is an increase in the general price level caused by an increase in the money supply relative to real output. It's measured by tracking the change in price of a bundle of goods. Fractional reserve banking creates money by loaning out more than the bank reserves. The rate at which they do so is called the money multiplier, but when it fails, when people all want to withdraw at once, it causes a bank run. You have this formula, monetary base times money multiplier times velocity equals the price level times output. In the short run, inflation causes distortions by artificially raising demand. Mayday, Mayday. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. So in conclusion, inflation is an increase in the general price level caused by an increase in the money supply relative to real output. It's measured by tracking the change in price of a bundle of goods. Fractional reserve banking creates money by loaning out more than the bank reserves, with the rate at which it does so being called the money multiplier. And when it fails, because everyone wants to withdraw at once, it causes a bank run. There's a relationship between the money supply and GDP that the total spending level must equal the total amount of money in circulation. People can't spend if they don't have money. In the short run, inflation causes distortions by artificially raising demand, with sticky prices hurting workers because the prices of goods go up faster than incomes. Whereas in the long run, money is neutral because the real opportunity costs and consumption will change. We have this term hyperinflation for when inflation is so extreme that the currency ceases to be usable, and government profits from moderate inflation through seigniorage. Now, with the basics of inflation covered, Mayday, Mayday, 1, 2, 3. Now, with the basics of inflation covered, we can combine inflation with our old supply and demand model to get the Keynesian model of the business cycle. This is one of the most influential models of the business cycle, although it's not the only one, and the rest of the unit will deal with it, the predictions it makes, and the policy recommendations it makes for how the government can help to solve recessions and depressions. I'll see you in the next one.